My name is Kelly O'Brien, and I lead both the Alliance for Regional Development and the Chicago Central Area Committee. If you're not familiar with the organizations, the Alliance was created in 2012 following a publication by the world's leading think tank, the OECD. The report talked about how the Milwaukee, Chicago, and Northwest Indiana corridor really operate as an economic unit. And the Alliance was created to be a neutral platform, bringing together the decision makers from government, academia, and the private sector to explore opportunities for cross-jurisdictional collaboration. The Chicago Central Area Committee is a 64-year-old civic group focused on the planning and development of Chicago. We started the webinar series back in late March, early April, in response to the pandemic. And originally, the webinar series was titled Pandemic Programming. June 1st, we transitioned to Disruption, Driving Innovation, and Embracing Economic Change, as that is the tagline of our upcoming summit, which is an annual event with the Federal Reserve Bank of Chicago. That's scheduled to be held the week of November 14th. Please watch your emails for more details. We greatly appreciate you taking your time to join our conversation today. As many of you know, we started this conversation on June 2nd. And I admit that I was somebody that was aware of the peaceful protests and sat in absolute dismay on Saturday night watching the looting and the destruction and really seeing what was happening coast to coast. And I thought it was critical that the CCAC Executive Board meet on that Sunday and issue a statement, which again is also on the CCAC website. I noticed many other organizations issued very heartfelt, profound statements in reaction to social injustice. CCAC member Kimberly Dowdell was kind enough to join the webinar series on June 2nd. And due to technology problems that we are hoping do not happen today, she agreed to come back, and we've expanded the conversation with two other amazing guests. So it is really truly an honor to be able to host this conversation. And I acknowledge upfront, this is a difficult conversation, and I may not say everything the right way, or I may not say something that I should, but I promise you that I'm doing my best. And I want to do my part in helping to have these conversations and helping to learn what we can do. So this webinar is titled Racial Injustice, Equity, and What You Can Do to Make a Difference. There is a Q&A button, and we do invite the audience to submit questions. So turning to my guests, I would like to say Kim Dowdell is a part of leadership at HOK. She is currently the president of NOMA, which is the National Organization of Minority Architects. And she was recognized last year by Crane's Detroit Business as one of the 40 under 40 honorees. Kim's accomplishments and awards are, she's a very distinguished, and we are very lucky to have her as part of CCAC.
Thank you,
Karen Freeman-Wilson, who I am so fortunate to have worked with on the Alliance side of my work, is currently the president and CEO of the Chicago Urban League. She served as the mayor of Gary from 2012 to 2019, and she has served in public office in many distinguished roles. And again, somebody that I really look up to and really look forward to working more closely together again. And then we have Michael Kaufman, Dean of the Loyola University Chicago School of Law. He has published dozens of books and countless law review articles. He is truly one of the most gifted teachers any student could ever hope to have. And I can say that I still have profound gratefulness for his end of semester civil procedure overview. I think that I owe a lot of my grade actually to that overview. And again, I am so very, very pleased to welcome all three of you today to this conversation.
Thank you, Kelly.
Thank you so much. Thanks for having us.
So I'd like the audience to know that during a dry run, we discussed that we would start in alphabetical order. So I am going to start with Kim and President Dowdell, and I want to again thank you for joining us today. And for those that did not tune in on June 2nd, can you please talk a little bit about the statement that you issued on behalf of NOMA and your BRAVE concept?
Absolutely, happy to. So actually, I'll start by sharing my screen, which shows the BRAVE graphic that the NOMA, that the NOMA board has approved, along with a brand new mission statement. So I just want to confirm. Can everyone see my screen? Okay, great. So
yes.
Essentially, what NOMA did in response to the tragic murder of George Floyd was, we really banded together as a board, and we called an emergency meeting the weekend of May 31st, and we issued a statement which has been shared on the CCAC website, and it's certainly on the NOMA.net website. But we also we're in the midst of a strategic planning exercise for the organization, an exercise we hadn't done in a number of years, and so we were in the middle of that process, and we decided that it was also time for us to refresh our mission statement. So NOMA's new mission, which was launched really in tandem with the public statement, NOMA's mission, rooted in a rich legacy of activism, is to empower our local chapters and membership to foster justice and equity in communities of color through outreach, community advocacy, professional development, and design excellence. And one of the main things that we feel really resonated with the public, not just architects, but people even outside of architecture, was this BRAVE graphic. And so BRAVE is an acronym for, as you can tell from the screen, banish racism, reach out to those who are grieving, advocate for the disinherited, vote in every American election, and engage each human that you meet as you would want to be engaged. And essentially it's a call, more broadly, to be brave and speak up when you see things that are not in alignment with our values, that when you see injustice, when you see disparities, I think it's important to be vocal. And so NOMA's taken a pretty active role in being vocal in our profession, and we're hoping that that translates into to other organizations and institutions really speaking up and being vocal, which is why I'm so grateful that you put together this this really amazing panel of people who are representing different perspectives and have different kind of audiences that they reach out to. So I'm really looking forward to this discussion and really happy to continue the conversation we had in early June. So thanks again, Kelly.
Thank you. And Kim, before we move to the next guest, I really was interested in learning about the oath that you take as an architect. Maybe you can share that with the audience.
Sure. So similar to the oath that a doctor takes to do no harm, architects, and many people don't know this, but architects are required to protect the health, safety, and welfare of the public. I think a lot of people assume that architects are supposed to make things look fancy, which we do, but it's really about the protection of health, safety, and welfare of the public. And NOMA is really challenging us to think about the public in its entirety. So that includes people from all socioeconomic backgrounds, people of all races. That no one should be excluded from that protection.
Thank you. Thank you. President Freeman-Wilson, I understand that the organization just published a paper, An Epidemic of Inequities, Structural Racism and COVID-19 in Black Community. Can you tell us a little bit about that paper?
Absolutely. Shortly after seeing the impact of the pandemic on Black and Brown communities, the disparate impact of both the incidents of COVID-19, but also the death from COVID-19, our team, particularly our research and policy team at the Urban League, began to think about not just the health aspect, but how it might impact the Black community from the perspective of employment, of education, of housing and of small businesses. And we saw a disparity across the board. And we thought that it wasn't necessarily enough to make those observations, but we knew that there would be movement at the federal, state, and local level to attempt to help citizens, to help individuals, companies, organizations to recover. But we thought it was not important only to recover, but also to be able to use this as a transformational opportunity for businesses, for employment opportunities, for so many, for our youth in terms of education. And so that was really the birth, or led to the birth of the epidemic of inequities. And, you know, it's almost ironic, and Kelly, I want to also thank you for inviting us to participate and for creating the forum, but it's almost an irony that shortly after that report was published, we began to see sort of this reaction, not just to the death of George Floyd, but to the deaths of Breonna Taylor and so many, many others. And I think that it happened in a time where you saw not just the pandemic and the impact of the pandemic, but also the reality that so much of what we were seeing in terms of the disparities that were witnessed connected with the pandemic were a result of structural racism, institutional racism, if you will, that folks really began to protest against those injustices that were evident from the deaths of George Floyd, the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor at the hands of police, but also the institutional thought and racism that would make it seem from the standpoint of a perpetrator to be okay to shoot an Ahmaud Arbery for just going for a run in his neighborhood. So that was sort of the place from which we were coming, our research and policy team, and a shout out to Stephanie Smits-Beckler and all of the authors of that piece, because we think that it not only provides a blueprint for the COVID response from a policymaking standpoint, but it also provides a blueprint for us to look at structural racism with a new lens.
So it looks like we lost Kelly temporarily.
It does.
Similar to last time, I was actually having technology issues, so then she filled in, so I will do the same. So okay. Dean Kaufman, would you mind just giving us an overview of some of the things that you're working on through the law school and how that translates into, you know, essentially what we can do, not just as obviously as a panel, but as a larger community to transform sentiment to action. That was something that we talked about in our planning call, and I really like that. So sentiment to action, what would be your response, Dean Kaufman?
Thank you so much, Kim. And before I answer, if it's okay, I think you both know, Karen and Kim know that I have a tradition, personal tradition, and also a tradition in our law school to begin every important occasion with an expression of gratitude. And this is a really important occasion. And I would begin by thanking Kelly, of course. I'll do it when she comes back and joins us, I hope, but also the Alliance and the Chicago Central Area Committee for hosting this incredible program. And in particular, I want to thank you both for allowing me to join you on this panel. I'm really honored to be a part of this conversation. I've admired your work from a distance for quite some time, and it's great to be on the same Zoom call with you both for an audience as well. Great to be with you.
Thank you. Likewise.
Great. I also feel extremely grateful, believe it or not, to be in a position of leadership at this time in our history. You know, from the pandemic, from COVID-19 to COVID-16-19, those twin pandemics, can be, I think, exhausting, overwhelming, flooded with all kinds of emotions and lots of work to be done. On the other hand, it's an incredible opportunity to create change, to lead an organization anew, look at the world fresh. Every day is different. I think we're all thinking outside the box in everything we do in terms of education, in terms of policy making and the like. So it's a great opportunity. There is a fierce urgency of now that I think if we miss the opportunity, we'll regret it for the rest of our collective lives. So I feel extremely fortunate and grateful and privileged to be able to be in this moment with you both and with the law school community.
Thank you.
In answering your question, I think it's really important to begin with a sense of leadership, and that these efforts are intentional and that they're comprehensive. And we've already talked a little bit about the statements you both have made in your own ways. The BRAVE acronym is wonderful. I love acronyms, as Kelly would attest from my bar review courses. And I also love the idea of transformation, Karen, you use that word. And let me go back and talk about what that means in this context a bit, maybe a little later in our conversation. But I think it was really important for me as the Dean of the Law School, along with our Dean for Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity, to make a statement after George Floyd's murder, saying the truth of that, to proclaim it for what it was, to name it, and then to call our community to act in response to that. So the first statement we made was a fairly high-level call to action issued on that Saturday after the murder of George Floyd. And then that became a real call to action. So our entire community came together and created a website for gathering all of our individual and collective efforts to combat systemic racism, to dismantle racism, root and branch. And that's a working, evolving document, which I'm very proud of at the law school. And then probably, in fact, most meaningfully to me, and probably most poignantly, I think I want to share with you all and those on the call, I had a chance to be involved with a panel discussion involving Robin DiAngelo, who wrote the book White Fragility. And that really transformed the way I think about my role as a leader. And so I wrote to our community a couple of days ago, actually, after thinking about this for a long time and having many sleepless nights, about my own personal journey. It was really confessional for how inadequate I had been in terms of not really understanding the real breadth of my white privilege and how much that white privilege has influenced all of my work and all of my days, and how I should get up every morning and realize that privilege really does shape who I am and how easy it is for me to navigate the world. And also, and here's the real pivot, that white privilege has for generations privileged our law school and has dominated our law school and overwhelmed our law school. And so with that, and I communicated this to our faculty and our administrative team, and I'll share with you that of the three statements, the last one, that personal confessional, has been by far the most meaningful and impactful. It has sort of led the way, inadvertently, that wasn't the intent, to transformation. And I've come to believe that although we have made a lot of really great incremental progress as a law school, we can talk about that. I'm really proud of the work we've done. Because these racisms are so intrusive, so insidious, and so systemic, that it really requires a systemic response. And so I moved in my own journey from incremental progress to transformation. And that requires a whole school effort, whether you're in a law school, a university, or a preschool. It requires everybody to be on board with that. And that's our current project at the law school. And there are all kinds of aspects to that in terms of admissions and training of teachers and curriculum and pedagogy and assessments. Whole school means whole school, but it requires everyone to be on board. And that's what we're doing now. So I think I'll leave it there. And we can pick up some of those threads, I hope, later on.
Great, thank you, Dean Kaufman. So one of the questions that we talked about in our planning call was to actually help the audience understand how we came to this work. So I'll answer the question last, but I'll ask Karen if you wouldn't mind going first, and then I'll round us out. Hopefully, Kelly will be back at that point.
Sure, but you're doing a great job, Kimberly. So I just want you to know, keep going. But you know, in terms of coming to this work, my mom was always one who was engaged in social justice efforts when I was a kid. And the irony for me was that I was an only child. I was raised as an only child. And so often she didn't have a babysitter, so I went wherever she went. So to the extent that she was a secretary in the office of the NAACP, I went to that meeting and I would hear them talk about housing rights, because that was a big deal in Gary at the time. I would hear them talk about public accommodation. And so I was always aware. And then shortly after graduating from law school and beginning my career, I became the director of the Indiana Civil Rights Commission. And I think that was a real eye-opening opportunity in terms of the institutional racism that still existed. Because at that time, I had been to law school and thought I had a lot of opportunities. I certainly had benefited from affirmative action and all of those things. But then to travel around the state of Indiana and to see the type of discrimination that was still going on, not just in employment and housing. And it just so happened that Lake County, Indiana, where Gary is situated, still remains one of the most segregated areas in the country. And the same rings true for Chicago, I might mention. But even at that time, which was back in the early 80s, there was this sense, even in public accommodations, that there were places in Indiana that you did not go. And so that still made me interested in the work. I remained committed during my term as mayor. And so when I got the call to join the Chicago Urban League, I thought it was a tremendous opportunity because it gave me the opportunity to continue the pursuit of the goal of racial justice, but I didn't have to worry about who would pick up the garbage or who would move the snow in the winter. So it was sort of this perfect opportunity to pursue my passion.
That's great. Thank you for sharing that. Dean Kaufman?
Well, like Karen, I think I'll start with my parents, who I was just blessed to have as role models in doing social justice work really all my life in terms of my upbringing and my faith, which really calls me to engage in acts of loving kindness, but also to try to heal the world, which is really a mantra of my faith. And we're told to not just study justice, but actually to pursue it. So in part, I became a teacher because I wanted to study and research about justice, but also I really want to become an impactful scholar and impactful teacher that actually does work in the real world as well. And that comes, I think, from faith and from my parenting. I had the incredible honor out of law school to work for Nathaniel Jones, who was a federal judge in the United States Court of Appeals for the Sixth Circuit in Cincinnati. Judge Jones was the general counsel for the NAACP for about 12 years and lost about every case imaginable in front of the Supreme Court in that era involving school segregation. And is, always will be my hero. I love him dearly. He just passed away a couple months ago, sadly. But he came to the law school about a year ago, and we named a professorship after him, and it was one of the highlights of my professional life to work for him and have him come back to the law school and see what we've been doing. So he led my efforts into a lot of school cases involving integration in Kansas City. I was on the school board because of him for about 12 years in my own community and integrated our neighborhoods and our schools as well. And then had to teach and write and do some service work at the law school along those lines. So my focus lately has been on research around and writing around issues of early childhood education, access issues, and racial justice issues at all levels of education, hoping to make a difference in that way to sort of follow in his footsteps, in at least a small part.
Great. Well, Dean Kaufman, thank you for sharing your story. President Freeman-Wilson, thank you for sharing yours. I guess I'll round it out. And then
You
we'll
tell
back
us,
over
Kim.
to
Yes,
Kelly.
absolutely.
Sure. As Kelly mentioned, I won an award in Detroit, actually in 2018, 40 Under 40, I'm a native of Detroit, although I spent about 14 years on the East Coast. But really my entry into considering architecture as a profession was when I was around 11 years old. And I was in the heart of downtown Detroit, which at that time in the early 90s was a ghost of its former self. Really beautiful old buildings were developed there in the 1920s and thereabouts. But by the time I came along, a couple of generations later, a lot of those buildings were boarded up and ghosts of their former selves. So I remember a distinct moment looking at the old Hudson's department store in Detroit, which at a certain period of time was the second largest department store in the world. And I remember looking around the streets and seeing there wasn't a lot of street life, if you will, and just it was sort of a depressed place at that point in time. And I just learned what an architect did in an art class. And so I decided at that moment, I was like, well, if architects fix buildings, and I want to become an architect and fix fix what I see in my hometown. I later learned that that's not entirely how this works, but architects are very much a part of that equation. A lot of it's economic development, certainly policy, real estate. There's so many different factors that go into creating great places and facilitating reinvestment where disinvestment can happen. And I later learned after architecture school, actually a little bit during architecture school and certainly afterwards when I studied public policy, that a lot of policies that were created in the 50s and 60s and thereabouts really impacted the built environment that we know today, particularly in some of the most under-resourced communities, and contribute to the wealth gap and contribute to the health disparities that we're literally seeing play out right now relative to the coronavirus. And so even though I went to architecture school and I was excited about the notion of rolling up my sleeves and going back home to Detroit and being a part of the solution, I later learned that many cities struggle with similar issues. So I ended up spending time living in Washington, D.C. and New York City and Boston before coming back home to Detroit. And I did that work, in terms of revitalization for about 4 years. I started out working in city government and then shifted to the private sector. But then I had an opportunity to come to this wonderful city, Chicago, about a year ago. And so I'm really, embracing the Midwest as a super region. I call it the mighty Midwest. And, just really excited about the notion of pooling resources as a region and really addressing a lot of the health and wealth gaps that we're seeing in our cities. And then specifically related to my work with NOMA, one thing I noticed once I actually got into the profession was that there weren't many people who looked like me. In fact, I'm the 295th Black woman to be licensed as an architect, or the 295th living Black woman. There were a few, who've passed away at this point, but not many, because there's a total of, I think, 453 at this point.
Wow.
There are about 116,000 licensed architects in the United States. There are actually roughly more attorneys than that in the state of California, just for the sense of scale.
That's incredible.
But in terms of African Americans overall, it's about 2,300. So that's basically less than 2%. And so even though I'm supposed to be working on urban revitalization efforts, I feel it's very important that we also make sure that the people who are working on urban revitalization and other types of projects, frankly, really represent the people. If we're protecting the health, safety, and welfare of the public, we as authors of the future of the built environment should be representative of the public. And so that's what I've spent a lot of time focused on in addition to my work with HOK. So I've been appreciative of HOK giving me the kind of time to help support the NOMA work and really push that forward. Kelly,
Awesome.
it's on you. You're back.
Welcome back.
Well, I'm not quite sure, Kim, why the only 2 episodes I've ever had technology problems was when we were together, but I do apologize that I am having spotty internet. And so today it's on my end, and I appreciate that the conversation has gone on. I'm sorry that I did not hear what was said while I was feverishly trying to figure out how to reconnect. But
it was brilliant and impactful.
I know. Well, luckily it's recorded, so I can go back. But I know where I dropped off was actually President Freeman-Wilson, what I wanted to ask you in regard to the report that you published, and just in terms of what's on the news, I was startled learning on the news about how the death rate is so different for people in zip codes that are very close to where I live. And yet in the zip codes where I live, the life longevity is much longer. So can you maybe comment on that and what you think would be some solutions to address it?
Absolutely. First and foremost, what we have to recognize is that it is not solely a function of health. There are some health aspects to what you have seen in terms of different health outcomes, and not just for the coronavirus, but different health outcomes across the board. And it's historically referred to as the social determinants of health. But what we are seeing particularly with the coronavirus is that one of the first things that folks said was stay at home, right? And in fact, I think all of us had the luxury of working from home. But CTA bus drivers, people who work in grocery stores, people who work in restaurants, even if the restaurant closed, many of them continue to provide carry-out service, right? Many people who work in the healthcare industry, there's been a large focus on doctors and nurses, and we are very grateful for them. But there are CNAs that work in hospitals. There's someone working in the hospital laundry, in the hospital cafeteria. And by and large, just in employment, you have a large representation of Black folks who work in those industries, who work in those jobs, who don't have the opportunity to stay at home. In the grocery business, it's true. But then you go from employment to the environment, and you think about the impact of pollution, of mold and housing on some of the other adverse effects that we see on housing on your health. If you have mold in your house, you are more likely to have asthma and other respiratory diseases. And if you have those diseases, that makes you at a greater risk of not just contracting the coronavirus, but also dying from it. You then move on to other aspects of health, because you may live in a food desert, right? And so if you live in a food desert, then you're less likely to eat healthy foods. You're more likely to suffer from diabetes and another underlying condition that may make you more susceptible to contracting and dying from the coronavirus. So all of these social determinants of health impact whether or not you become at a greater risk of having, not only contracting the virus, but dying from the virus. And we see these greater risks in not just the Black community, but in the Latinx, among Latinx individuals that live in our community. And thereby you see the greater impact of the coronavirus in Black and brown communities in Chicago and in many of the other cities across the country. And we found that in the study. So you asked about the solution. I think that's why I talked about earlier this being an opportunity to really think transformatively, to think about how we look at housing, right, in those communities, how we look at economic development so that we don't see those food deserts, how we look at the access to health in terms of where our most resourced hospitals and physicians are. Those are all of the things that we have to look at. How we look at access to jobs, and you know, how we steer people towards architecture. That's a sad commentary that Kim just gave us, to say that she can actually count the number of architects, of women of color who are architects. I can't count the women of color who are lawyers, because, right. And not to say that we have an oversupply, but certainly we don't have that level of representation. So we have to think about, what do we have now in terms of an opportunity to address structural racism in terms of access to education, access to higher education, access to certain professions, and how do we change that reality in this point in time?
So maybe that's an opening for Dean Kaufman. How do you respond to helping to create access to education?
Well, I love the idea of transformation, because I think, as I was mentioning earlier, you know, we all can point to really great work that we've been doing in our own organizations around issues of equity and diversity and inclusion. But I think the time is now for thinking about this holistically. And as Karen mentioned, everything is interconnected. So for example, we have a Center for Social Justice, which does great work. We have a public interest center. We've got a health justice project. We have environmental law programs and the like. We've got a criminal justice program, all doing great work. But they've been sort of inchoate in the sense that they're not connected to each other. Moreover, if you think about the through line with all of those efforts, it is clearly race. And that we can't hide that anymore. I think the one silver lining to this horrific murder of George Floyd is that that racist infrastructure has been laid bare for all of us to see. It's been hidden in plain sight, but now it is unmistakable and undeniable. And it permeates all that we do. So you can't really talk about health justice without talking about environmental law, for example. Or we can't do social justice in this law school without talking about race and talking about it overtly and then working on solutions around that. That makes it much more difficult because we can't be siloed anymore and think about our own particular aspects within a law school and then also within a university. We've got to work together across disciplines. So we have an Environmental Institute for Sustainability that has to be in touch with our health law center, for example, now, and with our criminal justice project, because they're all connected. And they do develop health impacts that then translate into education and performance in schools. So to your question about what we can do to provide access, in my own arena, it's a question about the law school in particular, and making sure that we provide opportunities and funding and resources and outreach to increase dramatically the number of persons of color who come to law school. And again, we've done really well at that incrementally. We've increased the numbers from 13% to 29% in the last 4 years, which until about a month ago I was very proud of. And I'm still proud of it. It took a lot of effort, but it's not enough. And it's going to require a transformation of the way we think about legal education to make that happen. And that means not just Loyola Law School. We're doing a lot of great work internally, but also working with our colleagues down the street at Northwestern and DePaul and Kent, and to think about all the other deans of law schools throughout the country who are doing similar kinds of things. How can we act together in a way that is consistent with the law and actually helps an entire pipeline of students coming into law schools that were closed off in years past? Very much like Kimberly's incredible efforts around her profession. How can we get the profession of law educators and lawyers to come together around these efforts, not just be a part in their discrete efforts alone. It's hard work. It requires a lot of communication, a lot of coordinating, a lot of activism, frankly, around these efforts as well. But it's so worth doing. And again, I'm thinking in terms of incremental change is just not going to get systemic relief and systemic change done. So that's my focus these days.
You know, well, Dean, I would also just jump in and say that as you think about recruiting more folks to law school, one of the things that I've seen is also a diversity of how you practice. Typically, you get like 2 or 3 choices. You're going to practice in a large firm or a small firm. You're going to practice in the prosecutor's office or office of the public defender, depending on what your, your frame of reference is. And then every now and then, people may practice public interest law. So much of what happens in public interest law, whether it's environmental justice or housing law or so many of the other areas, consumer rights law, are beneficial to people and really do have an impact on what their lives look like going forward. And so to be able to emphasize and encourage people to practice in those areas, I think is very important.
Absolutely, thank you. Yeah, and if I could just say one more thing, looking internally, that's, it's really clear, I think, to us, looking back at the law in this country, how complicit the law has been in racial injustice. So a lot of folks come to law school thinking the law is a great tool for change, and it is. But there's also a huge thread in the law throughout the centuries here that is simply neutral on its face, but not neutral in application.
Sure.
And we have to begin to look seriously, systemically, about the way in which law preserves white dominance, frankly, in this country, and has done for generations, such that at every major inflection point in education law, for example, we found that there has been an effort either to inspire or to legitimate racial subordination. And that's really built into the law itself. And so when I talk about systemic change, it's really incumbent upon us as educators to educate our incoming students to go out and to know that it's not okay to be neutral or silent or simply to enforce what is out there already, because that will be complicit in those architectures. Instead, we've got to be anti-racist in the way we practice law, not just neutral. And that's a complete shift, mind shift, in the way we educate our students.
Well, and to build on a point that President Freeman-Wilson made, recognizing how depressing really the statistic that Kim shared in terms of the number of Black female architects, it's also pretty dismal when you look at the number, whether it is African-American, Latinx, or even just women in general, that are in leadership at law firms and in corporate America. And Kim, President Dowdell, I know that you and I have had conversations and that you have some thoughts about how boards, corporate boards and law firms can restructure. Would you like to share your thoughts on how we might have more diversity kind of at the top?
Sure, and just as another, because I love stats, one stat that I think is, very telling of kind of where we stand, at least on the gender issue, is there are more men named David than there are women in general, in the seats of the Fortune 500 boards, or the CEOs of those companies. And just like one of many men's names, just David, there are more of them than there are all of the women combined. And so when you think about that, it shows that there's a ways to go, especially because, generally speaking, the US is about 50-50 men and women. And similar things are true to be said about people of color in terms of just not having representation in those high level positions. And so there's this notion that, diversity and inclusion is important, which it is, but they come second to justice and equity. In fact, justice and equity yields diversity and inclusion. So if you have justice and equity in some of the highest levels of power, then, for example, if you have more representation than in boards and other power structures, then you actually end up having, the lower levels of leadership, or even, just the sort of regular, members of a team, will in many ways reflect the boards that, that sort of lead them. And so, I'm of the opinion that we have to take a really hard look at our boards, whether they be law firms or architecture firms, or certainly in government and other institutions, boards of trustees for schools, universities, I think, are really important to really push diversifying. Because without that, it's hard to have a voice in the room or a seat at the table when there isn't a space for you to share your perspective and to speak on behalf of those who are largely voiceless. So I think it's just really important that we're brave enough to kind of bring that up and make sure that we're articulating how important that is, so that those demographics can start to change. Speaking of demographics, one other stat that I often mention is that according to the Brookings Institute, by 2045, the majority of residents in the United States will be people of color of some sort. And so that's not very long from now, actually. It's 25 years. And if we as a society don't really wrap our minds around how to peacefully coexist and how to make sure that we're not creating hierarchy, and that we're not essentially as Michael was saying, being anti-racist, I think that we're going to have some real challenges moving forward if we can't figure this out like right now, like yesterday. So this is pretty urgent, I would say.
Thank you. President Freeman-Wilson, I have a tough question for you as a former mayor. And really understanding budgets and understanding taxpayers. And so a lot of what's really needed costs a lot of money. And unfortunately, we're in a country that's practically bankrupt. Illinois is a state that's practically bankrupt. The city of Chicago is practically bankrupt. Gary, and it has its struggles.
Sure.
So what do you say to payers about the investments that need to be made, and how do we as a country pay for this?
I think with anything, you invest in what you value. And so this is really about prioritization. I have been listening to, participating in a lot of discussions, as an example, about defunding the police. And when you listen to the discussion, certainly there are some folks who want to eradicate all police departments. There's no question about their intentions. But by and large, that conversation is really about, can we prioritize access to education? Can we prioritize those things that will make it unnecessary for the police to engage in communities? Because the reality is that there will be other opportunities in other places. Now, do we need police reform? Absolutely. There's no question about that. But I don't know that reform is simply doing away with. It really is focusing on that reform, but also prioritizing the other things that we need, such as investment, economic investment in communities, such as investment in education and affordable housing that runs the gamut. And I think the way that you have to make those decisions as elected officials is to determine what you value. Do you value equity and justice? If the answer is yes, then where you spend your money and how you spend your money should reflect those values. And it's not just in government, it's in the corporate arena. What's your supply chain look like? Is it diverse? It's in the nonprofit world. What does my supply chain look like? Certainly the Urban League spends a lot less money than the city of Chicago or the state of Illinois, but my supply chain ought to be reflective of my values, as should HOK, as should Loyola, and as should the other institutions that have a tremendous amount of buying power.
Well, and again, I'll ask this question to you as a former mayor, elected official. We have, CCAC is doing some work with the Chicago Department of Planning and Development, and we've been working in several neighborhoods in the south and west sides of Chicago now for probably 2 years or more, I would say. And so it's really been very eye-opening, and it's been a great education for all of our members to visit areas that we may not otherwise be as familiar with, kind of on a block by block, parcel by parcel basis. And so when we saw on May 30th and what unfolded after the looting and the destruction, it literally brought me to tears. In one interview of a senior who was really crying because the pharmacies, the CVS, the Walgreens, had been damaged to the point where the doors were closed, and she didn't know where she was going to get her medication. So how would you talk to corporate America about making the investments to open up these stores again?
Well, first and foremost, I want to say it was certainly heart-wrenching to hear of those individuals who were, and particularly seniors who are not as mobile as others of us, to hear them talk about losing access to basics like medicine. But I also, and I don't want to say but, and I think it's important to understand that many of the folks who were engaged in civil unrest were doing it as a result of not feeling heard. I think Dr. King said that rioting is the language of the unheard. But here's the thing. Think about one time when you're talking to somebody that you think should care about you, and you are trying to explain that something to them that is of the utmost importance to you over and over again, and you don't feel like they're listening or that they are getting what you're saying. What do? You may raise your voice, you may bring on the table, certainly you are going to do what you believe you need to do to get their attention. And I think that's what we saw with the looting. And I'm certainly not saying that this is something that's that we should not hold people accountable for, because I think accountability is important. But I think that, people who say, well, that looting was just unacceptable. The results were something that were undesirable. I would certainly concur. But to understand why that happened, what was at the root of that activity, a majority of it. Now, there are some folks who were just opportunists. Let's just be clear about that.
Black
but the majority
and
of
others.
yeah.
It wasn't just
But
black.
yeah, and it wasn't. I mean, people, black, brown, white, who were simply opportunists, but understand how voiceless and unheard people felt as a result of that. And the good news is that you have commitments from Walgreens already to rebuild stores. You have commitments from Jill Osco, and to go back to the elected officials who have the bully pulpit, who have influence and the ability to say to these corporate entities, I want you to prioritize stores in those communities that have seen the least investment. There are ways for them to influence those decisions.
Thank you. I apologize, because of my internet connection, I don't have access to see if there are being questions submitted. President Dowdell, if there are questions submitted, will you read those?
Sure.
And while you look and try to kind of gauge maybe a few that can be asked and answered, let me turn back to Dean Kaufman And I'd love for you to comment outside of the law firm, or I'm sorry, the law school. Can you talk about the criminal justice system and what reforms you think are, kind of front of mind?
Sure, Kelly, thank you so much. So much of the focus since George Floyd's murder has been about police brutality and the criminal justice system itself, which requires a tremendous wholesale reform effort, as I mentioned earlier, transformative effort from policing, from resource officers that go into schools that don't have the training to do that, to reimagining the school to prison pipeline, to zero tolerance policies, to discipline reform. It requires an entire transformative effort that results ultimately in law enforcement. And we're doing quite a bit of work around what works in terms of making police officers better equipped to handle communities and have better trained to do so. And the work is a lot of work is around even things like labor agreements, where traditionally, in some contexts, police officers are protected by clauses in their agreements from prosecution sometimes, or at least from sanctioning. So it's really a whole school effort. But if I could jump on to a comment that Karen made that I have tremendous affinity for, I really appreciate it. You asked her about different funding options and priorities, and I totally agree that it's about where you turn your money and your priorities as well. I have found that the one thing that really gives us hope, I think, among all the efforts is the drive toward universal preschool, early childhood education. And I say that because it's sort of a microcosm of how arguments can be made for funders. There are a lot of folks who felt that giving access to preschool to children 4 and 5 years old was the right thing to do, or the moral thing to do, the correct thing to do, and the equitable thing to do, all of which I think is true. But it wasn't until an economist was able to calculate that an investment of $1 in a really high quality early childhood education program resulted in a $7 gain in profits for the entire community. That 1 to 7 return on investment ratio. Until that Nobel Prize winning economist said that, the movement toward universal preschool really had stalled. And so I think it's important to take a sort of a multifactorial approach to policy. I happen to think that because of that ratio, because of that investment return, that's really an important aspect of reform. And that in turn would, I think, improve the kind of things that Karen was talking about, which is the environment, healthcare, policing, schools. When you start early, when you target money early, those investments work tremendous dividends throughout a child's life. And the evidence is pretty clear that's true. So I think that's a really important lesson for all of us in terms of how we sell, frankly, investments in really good priorities. We do it in a multifaceted way where we talk about the moral and spiritual dimension, but also the economic benefits of that as well.
So it looks like we have one question.
Okay.
And so it's actually directed to Dean Kaufman. And it says, and I think that probably all of us could answer this question as leaders, that you always want more than what you have currently realized. But here's the question. How can the professor or dean, that's really what it should say, be proud of his work at the law school when he inferred that they have missed the mark and have dedicated themselves now to combating systemic racism at the law school, which he is proud of? How does he rationalize the two perspectives?
That's a great question, and it's a question that, frankly, has kept me up at night. Not that you should care about me, but it does keep me up at night because, as I mentioned, I think we are justifiably proud of the progress we have made in terms of incremental steps toward, for example, diversifying our student body. In all kind of objectivity, those are really important percentage increases, no question about it. But that's not enough. It's a foundation for much more transformative work. So I can be proud of what we've done, but not pleased, not happy, not satisfied. And that's how I sort of reconcile it in my own mind. But it's important to have that momentum and that foundation for future work as well. If we're starting from scratch, it'd be harder to become transformative overnight. So I think in getting that to that point, my community, my faculty, my staff, my administrators are fully committed to this work. And I'm not sure they would have been if we were at zero. So we've done a lot of work to get to this point, and now I can be more proud if we get to more transformative change.
Thank
And
you.
I think it's reflective of everybody's sense that, you know, at the end of the day, when you sort of look at what you've done on a particular day, on a week, or even a year, you think, okay, we got these things done, and I'm pleased to say that and see it, but there's so much more to do. And I think what we have to remember is that we can't get burnt out or weary. The Bible teaches us not to be weary in well-doing, right? For in due season you will reap if you faint not. And so we can't get tired of doing well. We understand there's a lot to do, but you know, it just gives us a sense that, you know, of mission, of real mission, I think.
So I see that unfortunately it's 2:30, which means this hour has flown by.
It's
And I
flown by.
And that is a perfect segue to my last question, which I'm hoping each of you can just impart one action that you would like the audience to give consideration in terms of what they can do. What can they do to make a difference? And so kind of going back around in alphabetical order, I'll start with President Dowdell.
Great. Thank you again, Kelly, for bringing us all together. In fact, I think it's really important that we have cross-disciplinary conversations, you know, cross-sector conversations, and that we run towards difficult conversations because that's the only way that we can really break down the barriers that, you know, that are creating a lot of the challenges that we're seeing. You know, I think that a lot of what I believe racism is about is fear. And I think that people tend to fear what they don't know or what they don't understand. And so the extent to which we can foster communication and understanding, I think that's going to help us build bridges to a more peaceful future.
Thank you. President Freeman-Wilson.
Well, first and foremost, let me again echo the thanks of creating this forum, of having us all here. I've enjoyed each and every one of you. And I appreciate the work that you do. I would welcome folks to take a look at the report on COVID-19 and to share it with others, because it really does talk about how structural and institutional racism is at the core of so much that we've seen with the coronavirus, but in so much that we see in society. And I think that in sharing it, think about how you in your work or in your life can contribute to the eradication of institutional racism. Now, I know that seems like a big job, but I think that if everybody takes it on, then it becomes a much smaller and achievable goal for all of us.
Thank you. Dean Kaufman.
Well, I think, again, thank you so much, Kelly, for having us on this panel, and thanks for the really great questions and conversation. I'll start with a personal. As I began about an hour ago with talking about my calling toward loving kindness, I think empathy is talked a lot about these days, but I think the goal of perspective taking, especially in this environment, is really important as a personal goal. Can we put ourselves in someone else's shoes and really see the world through their eyes and understand their perspective? That would go a long way toward increasing our dialogue and conversations in a constructive way, I think, interpersonally. Beyond that, I would suggest reading. As I mentioned earlier, White Fragility meant a lot to me. I'm sure there are many other books out there that could, I think, have a great impact on our audience today. I also would recommend highly Nicole Hannah-Jones's work in the New York Times. She was one of the authors in the 1619 Project. And you may have seen this yesterday or a couple days ago, wrote an article in the New York Times as well about reparations. That I think will transform the way you think about the world. I recommend that to anybody. In terms of action, we haven't talked today about something that I love called design thinking, which is a human-centered approach to solving complex problems that came out of Silicon Valley, but can really be used for all the problems we talked about today as solutions. I think it's a way to mediate really good progress, incremental change, and transformation. And if our audience is interested in design thinking, just Google it. And I think it would help you find ways you could discreetly but effectively measure some impact in what you do outside of your own institutions. So thank you so much.
Well, I think you just gave me a topic for another webinar. I will absolutely look into that. I am so grateful to all three of you for today's conversation. I apologize again for my internet spottiness in and out, but I think it was a fabulous, informative discussion. I want to thank the audience for tuning in today and staying with us for just a little bit over an hour. This is, we normally only meet for 30 minutes, so it's a big commitment. I understand everybody's busy. I want to remind you that we do have a 30-minute episode on this Thursday, July 2nd. Who can believe we're in the month of July? We have the Deputy Governor of Illinois that's going to be talking about Restore Illinois and how we just moved into phase 4. We're going to understand how can Illinois be a state that's in the top 5 or 6 states with the number of COVID cases, and yet we are progressing into stage 4. When can we get to stage 5? And what happens if we have to hit pause and move backward? So I think that's going to be a really important conversation, and I encourage everybody to register and join us on Thursday. So with that, I have a heart of gratitude for all of the speakers today. Thank you for your friendship. Thank you for your support.
Likewise.
And I really genuinely look forward to keeping in touch and working together to do good.
Absolutely.
With that,
you all take care.
We're signing off. Have a great day, everybody. Thank you.
Okay. Bye-bye.